Hello and welcome to this 4-part Bible study series. Now, through this Bible study that will last over the next 4 weeks, we will be covering the entire epistle of 1 Peter. But we will not be doing a word-for-word study of this epistle. Instead, we will be focusing our attention on just one major theme that runs throughout the entire epistle, and that is the theme of hope in the epistle of 1 Peter. Now, based on my own personal study of this epistle, I have come to understand that Peter writes his epistle and places extra emphasis on the theme of hope. And he always talks about the hope that believers have in Christ. So, what will we learn throughout the next 4 weeks? From week 1, we will ask the question, what is hope? And we will answer it from a cultural and also biblical perspective. In the second week, we will look at the epistle of 1 Peter and see how Peter explains hope in his context. In the third week, we will look at the response to hope, and this will cover 2 parts. So the third week will be the response to hope part 1. The fourth week will be the response to hope part 2. So with that in mind, let us begin our study of this epistle of 1 Peter. Now, before we actually go into any single chapter or verse in this epistle, it is very important, since it's a Bible study, to understand the context. And when we talk about context, there are several things that we need to look at. First is the author. Who wrote the book of Peter? There are many debates on who the real author is, but I think for the sake of time and also to avoid, entering into a very messy world of arguments and debates, we will just accept the canonical attribution to Peter, the disciple of Jesus, as the author of this epistle. Now, if anything, the burden of proof actually lies on those who object to Peter being the genuine author of this epistle, compared to those who accept, Peter's authorship. So with the topic of authorship out of the way, let's look at the audience. Who was Peter writing this letter to? And from chapter 1 verse 1, we can see that Peter mentions a list of places where the believers were dispersed, or located. So just from internal evidence within the epistle, it is easy for us to understand that this letter was intended for the diaspora believers dispersed because of persecution throughout the regions of Asia Minor. Now, the provinces being mentioned in chapter 1 verse 1 are actually Roman provinces located in Asia Minor. So we would assume that the audience of Peter's epistle would comprise of both Jews and Gentiles. Now, when we talk about the audiences as well, we can notice a very interesting word coming up in chapter 1 verse 1. And from the ESV version, this word is the word exiles. In other translations of the Bible, it would use words like strangers or foreigners. Now, when Peter uses this word in his epistle, it can carry 2 meanings. First, a literal meaning, and a spiritual meaning, the second. A literal meaning, to symbolize that, the Jews and also the Gentiles are actually literal strangers living in these lands. Now, the Jews and the Gentiles were actually displaced because of, first, for the Jews especially, displaced because they were Christians in their own homelands. For the Gentiles, a lot of these Gentiles were forced to migrate from Rome to these provinces in Asia Minor to make these places a little bit more Romanized in culture. So, not only the Jews were strangers in a foreign land, but the Gentiles too were strangers displaced from Rome to Asia Minor to live in these foreign places. So this is the literal meaning of the word exile. The spiritual meaning of this word would mean that all believers, as Peter would present in his later chapters, are actually foreigners and strangers in this world. Because we are not really citizens of this world. We are simply passing by, and we are actually awaiting that better place in the future, that is heaven. We are citizens of heaven and strangers in this world. And this is a hope itself. And this is where we see the first appearance of this theme of hope surfacing in this epistle, where Peter plays around with this word, exiles, to address the present situation of the audience, but also uses this word to remind the audiences of the hope that is awaiting them, that is the hope of heaven. So with that, now let us look at the social context. What was going on during the time that Peter wrote this epistle to the believers? In order to answer this important question, we need to place this epistle into a time frame to decide what was going on during that particular period of time. Now, Peter was martyred during the early 2nd century, so it would be highly impossible for him to have written this epistle during the 2nd century. Many scholars and their research have determined that Peter's epistle was written and circulated somewhere around the 1st century, that would be roughly around 65 AD to 68 AD. So since it was written during the 1st century, it would place Peter's epistle and also the social context in the time where no official persecution was going on yet. Now, most persecutions at that time was limited to the city of Rome alone, but it hasn't yet spread to the provinces around Rome and also the distant provinces of Rome. So evidence to support this stand for an absence of official persecution can be derived from the letter of Pliny, who was a Roman lawyer living in Syria. And he wrote this particular letter to the Emperor Trajan, in which he writes that he has never participated nor witnessed the trials of a Christian in his province of Syria. So since there was no official persecution going on, what sort of suffering were Peter's audiences going through? The suffering that they were going through then would be the unofficial kind, like harassment, false accusations, loss of rights, and also ostracization from the community. Now, these suffering may seem slightly bearable, not as intense or frightening as Roman persecution, but it is still a very difficult situation for believers to be living in. Such persecutions went on daily, and it came mostly in the form of verbal abuse in the public. Christians would have to endure foul words and insults hurled at them as they walked the streets. Believers were even assaulted physically by those who opposed them, and they could report these physical assaults to no one. Believers were also known to have lost their jobs because their employer opposed Christianity. And the courts, again, the courts were largely against Christians. The courts would do nothing to help the plight of Christians. So living in such circumstances was indeed very challenging and demotivating for the believers. So for that reason, Peter writes the epistle to them as a reminder of what they were anticipating and what they already possess, that is hope. So, with the context of the epistle now in place, we will now proceed to answer the question of this week. What is hope? And as we focus on this simple yet diverse topic, we will approach it from a few perspectives, namely the Greco-Roman culture and how they understood hope. And then we will look at the Judaism culture of hope. And finally, we will look at the biblical understanding of hope. Now, the reason for doing such a detailed study on this topic coming from different angles is to understand why Peter needed to write a clear statement of what hope really is to the believers back then. For us, when we can properly understand what hope is, it will help us to be fully, not partially, but fully assured of our hope as believers. So let's start off now by looking at the Greco-Roman culture and how they understood hope. Now, the Greek philosophy on hope is this: it is man's own projections of his future. The outcome of such hope is either you get comfort in a difficult situation, or it serves to greatly deceive a person, to which the latter is always the case. Now, according to Plato, a famous Greek philosopher, he views hope for the living as the expectation of seeing their loved ones in death. So if we were to summarize the Greco-Roman culture of hope, the Greek culture does not really have a set intellectual or spiritual concept of what hope really is. It is anything and everything a man dreams of his future. And since there is nothing consoling about the Greco-Roman concept of hope, the only consolation they find is in the possibility that they might meet with their loved ones after death. Now, when Peter writes to the believers concerning their hope, he was not really writing to prevent the believers from being influenced by the Greco-Roman culture of hope. Instead, he is writing to them to reinforce the idea that Christian hope is not something that man conjures up. It is a concrete and evident hope that does not deceive, instead can truly give comfort and motivation to continue to persevere in the present. So this is hope in the context of the Greco-Roman culture. Now, what about hope in the Judaism culture? Now, the Judaism culture will relate more to Peter, who is a Jew, and also the Jews living in the regions mentioned in Peter's epistle. Now, within Judaism, there are two streams of Judaism, namely Rabbinic Judaism and Hellenic Judaism. The similarities of both streams is that both have an eschatological expectation of, first, the coming of the Messiah and the restoration of the kingdom of Israel. However, the difference is that Rabbinic Judaism holds that unless Jews can completely obey the laws of God, God's kingdom cannot yet be established. Now, Hellenic Judaism, with a little bit of Greek influence, hence the name Hellenic Judaism. Hellenic Judaism focuses more on the immortality of life and how God can give salvation, and then death becomes the perfection of man. Now, both streams of Judaism are not wrong per se. However, when one chooses to follow the extremes of Rabbinic Judaism, the tendency arises then to focus on the works needed to be done in order to obtain salvation and hope. Now, Peter was writing against this concept of buying or working for your salvation. A concept that was actually proposed very strongly by the proponents of Rabbinic Judaism in the churches in these regions. Hellenic Judaism seems to be in line with what Peter is writing to the believers, because it has its focus in God for salvation, and it also has this emphasis on the hope of life after death for the believer. The outcome of restoration for Israel may be a nationalistic message for the Israelites, but in the grand scheme of God's plan, Restoration of the nations will be an accurate picture of the hope that we all have in God. So this is hope in the Judaism culture. Now, what about hope from the Bible, the biblical view of hope? We're going to look at the Old Testament and the New Testament for this segment. Now, from the Old Testament, there are 4 Hebrew terms that are constantly used to demonstrate hope in God. And these 4 words are the first, Yahal, to wait or to long for God. The second, Kawah, to long after God. The third, Hakah, to wait for God. And the fourth, which is somewhat like our Malay word, that is Sabar, to hope in God. Now, these terms symbolizes assurance, but there is also a hint of expectation combined with a certainty and tension of an event in the future. Assurance in the sense that if you wait for God, there is hope. There is an expectation because when you wait on God and you hope in God, you expect God to work on your behalf. There is a tension because in the midst of waiting, sometimes there might be doubts, there might be uncertainties, there might be times where we find it hard to see whether or not God is working. So the Hebrew terms for hope actually demonstrates all 3 aspects of hope. First is an assurance. It is a certainty because we are putting our hope in God. But at the same time, there is also a tension while we wait for God to act in our midst. So in the Old Testament, hope is something that is, widely preached. And Yahweh, which is the name for God in the Old Testament, Yahweh is central to the subject of hope. That is why in the Old Testament, the Israelites were constantly reminded by the prophets and the leaders to wait upon Yahweh for forgiveness and salvation. And we can find some of these messages in passages like Psalm 71 verse 5, Isaiah 51 verse 5, Jeremiah 14 verse 8, and Jeremiah 17 verse 13. So this is the concept of hope in the Old Testament. Now, how about the New Testament? You see, in the New Testament, much of the epistles were written by Paul. Thus, when we study the New Testament concept of hope, I will only focus on the Pauline concept of hope. Now, especially in the book of Romans, Paul uses the Greek term for hope, that is elpis and elpizo. And he uses these 2 words a total of 4 and 13 times throughout the entire book. A total of 17 times then, the word hope and its other version, elpizo, is used in the book of Romans. Now, the secular use of the term elpizo, however, can actually carry a negative denotation, uncertainty of whether or not the outcome will be good or bad. But in the in the New Testament, when Paul uses this term elpizo, he uses it and it is always a positive expectation of something good. There is no negative connotation at all attached to this word in Paul's use in the book of Romans especially. In the New Testament, hope always refers to 2 things. First, salvation, which is for us in the present. The second thing it always refers to is the hope of heaven, the security of our future. The concept of hope in the New Testament is one that is very concrete because it is based upon Christ, the work of Christ on the cross, and most importantly, his resurrection. Because of Jesus who came down to this earth, because he was willing to go to the cross to pay the price for our sins, and because he died and rose again on the third day, we have a hope of salvation, and we need not to fear death, because death is the beginning of our new life living in the resurrected body. And all this is possible because Christ rose from the dead, and with his resurrection, that resurrection power now lives in us. Now we have come to the end of today's session, and the preliminary study that we have done today on this topic of hope from 1 Peter hasn't yet reached its conclusion. Today is merely the introduction, it's just the beginning, and next week we're going to go deeper into the epistle to see what Peter talks to the believers and teaches them about hope. But since this is a Bible study, I think it is very appropriate that this week we conduct a very thorough investigation on what ancient culture and also the biblical understanding teaches us about this topic of hope. So we can see that there are some points of similarity in the idea of hope between Peter's concept and that of the Greco-Roman and also the Judaism culture. Now, Peter, being a Jew, was quick to point out that the object of hope is Jesus, who died and resurrected. And that's found in chapter 1, verse 3. And he always mentions that because of Jesus, they, referring to both Jews and Gentiles, have a hope of salvation and an eternal inheritance in heaven. Now, Peter's concept of hope differs slightly from rabbinic Judaism because he does not hold to their viewpoint that they need to fulfill all the laws completely in order to usher the coming of the Messiah. Now, according to Peter, Jesus has already come, and through faith, all people are given a hope of a new life and also a hope of the future in heaven. Peter is strongly against the concept of working or using good works to buy your salvation. Now, Peter also holds firmly that the eschatological hope, that is the hope of the future when life on earth ends, the eschatological hope is not the earthly restoration of Israel. It is not like what the nationalistic message, Israel have been holding on and firmly believe, that is, when Jesus comes, he will restore Israel back to its former glory days and restore the Davidic kingdom. No, that is not Peter's view, but he views the eschatological hope as a future inheritance for all believers in heaven. Peter's teaching in the later verses to do good is not a message to do good to obtain salvation, but it is a message to do good as a response to the hope of salvation that Christ has given to all humans. So these are some very, similar points between Peter's concept of hope and also some points where he differs from the Judaism culture and also from the Greco-Roman culture. So I hope that, you have learned something from this evening session, and I hope that you will continue to join us for next week's session as we dive deeper into the epistle of Peter and see what Peter talks about hope in his letter to the believers. Now, before I close, I'd like to encourage all of you to send in your questions. If you have any questions, do send them in by personal message either onto our Facebook page or you can write your questions in the comment section. And next week, towards the end of the session, I will do my best to answer your questions. So with that, we will close and we will end today's session. God bless you. We will see you all next week.